This is Skyblock, and if you've ever played it for a while, you've probably heard something about the Precursors. The first place most people will hear about the Precursors is in the Crystal Hollows, where you can find the Precursor remnants and the Lost Precursor City. Other people may have first heard Sidon mention that his giants are Precursor corpses on floor 6 of the Catacombs. Maybe you heard them mentioned in the Rift by Julian when doing Vampire Slayer or by Dr. Emmett when doing the Mirrorverse. These are quite literally the only 4 times the Precursors are directly mentioned by name, which leads a lot of people to not actually know who the Precursors are. Before we start, I want to mention that this video won't be very much about any theories or speculations. I'll mainly discuss things that are undoubtedly true. But with that out of the way, we can learn from Professor Robot in the Precursor Remnants that the Precursors were an ancient race with highly advanced technology, but supposedly went extinct eons ago, and only left behind the automatons as well as the ruins of their civilization. There are other locations where the Precursors lived as well though, like the Precursor ruins in the Dungeon Hub and Auruo's lab in the Crimson Isle. We know all of these locations are Precursor buildings based on the architectural design. Obviously, the 2 locations with Precursor in the name are easy to figure out, but Auruo's lab doesn't instantly appear to be Precursor architecture. If we look closely at the architecture, however, it becomes pretty clear. Not only are the block choices very similar, like smooth stone slabs, diorite, and stone bricks, but the furniture is also incredibly similar, with the same style of bookshelves as well as the same style of chairs. On top of that, both other confirmed Precursor buildings are located underground, and Auruo's lab is under the Crimson Isle, so that's yet another consistency. As for the Precursor's appearance, we don't have much to go off of. In Master Mode, which is generally considered to be the canonical forms of the boss fights, all the Precursors are simply dressed in black. It's hard to say if every Precursor was like Sidon's giants though, as Sidon has his own giant that's an amalgamation of the 4. This means that Sidon not only has the power to heavily modify the Precursor bodies, but is willing to do so, which means it's possible that the original 4 corpses are slightly or even heavily modified from their original form. However, on floor 7, the giants can spawn as Bloodroot mobs, and they drop items that are labeled Precursor relics, which means that they must have been created by the Precursors, so at the very least the items they possess are most definitely authentic Precursor creations. It's also safe to assume that most, if not all, Precursors had laser eyes, as there's a drop in floor 6 that's simply called a Precursor eye, which can shoot a laser beam. Because this item isn't specifically attributed to one of Sidon's giants, it's probably just a general feature of all Precursors, rather than just Sidon's Precursor corpses. So, the Precursors were giants with extraordinary weapons, laser eyes, and technology more advanced than anything else in the world. The only thing they left behind were ruins of their civilization as well as a few of their technological creations like the automatons, but have been extinct for eons. Or have they? There are a few signs to suggest that the Precursors didn't go extinct and simply left without a trace. The wizard in the Hub Forest Tower says that he believes a catastrophic event is looming in the future, and it's very likely that it has something to do with the Precursors. This is basically confirmed by Dr. Emmett in the Mirrorverse. If you ask him about what the wizard told you, he tells you that it's highly sensitive information, but it's related to the Precursors. It's impossible to say how the Precursors are related to this event though. They could simply be involved or be the ones to cause it. Regardless, there's not really any way to tell. On top of what Dr. Emmett says, there's one more NPC in the Rift that discusses the Precursors' active endeavors. In the Stilgore Chateau prison is Julian, who says that he's searching for traces of the Precursors, but with no luck. He questions that if they're attempting to return to our world, then shouldn't they come through the Rift? He also mentions Oruo, the statue in the quiz puzzle in Dungeons, and that he found the Blessing of Time in the chateau. A lot of people make the mistake of assuming that Julian is implying Oruo is a Precursor, but he isn't. The text when talking about the Precursors in Julian's dialogue is consistently colored dark red, while Oruo is just yellow. It's very possible that Oruo is an incredibly powerful being similar to the Precursors, but based on the fact that the text for him and the Precursors are intentionally different colors, it's unlikely that Oruo is a Precursor. It seems odd that they would go out of their way to make the text different colors if they were the same things. Regardless, Julian makes it clear that the Precursors are planning to return to our world using the Rift. It's safe to assume that their return has something to do with the calamitous event that the wizard talks about. We just don't know what that is or what the Precursors' involvement will be. Julian himself is a rather odd character though. Elise in the Rift says that he appears friendly but warns caution. She explains that the people in his organization have committed questionable acts, and one doesn't reach his rank without crossing some lines. Julian appears to be part of the mage faction from the Crimson Isle, but his clothing doesn't indicate any clear connection to the mage faction group. The way ranks are determined within the mage faction is usually based on the color of a person's clothing, with secret agents and guards having black cloaks, and the queen, captain of mage guards Ahone, and one of the queen's guards all having white cloaks. This makes Julian's coat very confusing, as it's half and half. Based on the fact that there are no discernible connections between him and the existing ranks within the mage faction, whichever organization he's working for may not be connected to the mages in the Crimson Isle at all. A leading theory is that Julian is part of the Mage Association, which would make sense, as some of the things they've done according to the dungeon journals would line up with how Elise describes the organization. This would also explain why Julian seems to know so much more about the Precursors than most other NPCs. The majority of NPCs seem to imply that the general knowledge of the Precursors is that they're just dead and gone. Julian is one of the only NPCs in the entire game to fully imply that the Precursors are still alive. Julian knowing so much about the Precursors wouldn't make sense if he was in the Mage faction, but it would make sense if he was a part of the Mage Association. But if the Precursors are alive, then where did they go and why? Why would the Precursors up and leave without a trace, leaving their civilization to crumble? Well, we don't really know why. All we know is that whatever caused them to leave was important enough that they left a lot behind and made sure to hide the fact that they were alive at all. It's very clear that the Precursors were intent on not being known to be alive while living in our world, as they're only known to have lived underground, like the dungeon hub under the Hub Mountain, Or's lab which is under the Crimson Isle, and of course the Crystal Hollows. The Precursors were very clearly intent on keeping their existence a secret, which is likely why they would want to seem dead rather than simply gone. Based on the fact that there are people investigating the Rift for evidence of the Precursors, they must have left our world using the Rift. The Rift is a place that connects past, future, and other worlds, which Elise confirms. She tells us that some wizards in the Rift come from different worlds, and that they could be from the past or the future. If the Precursors did use the Rift to leave our world, then they must have ventured to another world for some unknown reason, and plan to return in some relation to the catastrophe that the wizard warns us about. There are theories as to what could have caused the Precursors to leave, like Backward Eelman's theory that the Precursors created the Rift and left right before the Calamity, which is the event that shattered Skyblock into all of the separate islands. But because this is just a theory and also not my own work, I won't go too into detail about it, but if you would like, you can read his theory on the forums using the link in the description. Whatever caused them to leave, it's clear that they plan to return due to another calamitous event, which I assume we'll see during the Mountaintop release. Unfortunately, by the time that update drops, the Precursors might have actually gone extinct.